we want to protect our customers and our athletes, and this is the right thing for them. The faster we let them know, the less likely they are going to have negative outcomes in other places because of the password they happen to use on MyFitnessPal is the same password they used at a bank or somewhere else. And the more rapidly we can let them know, the better they're going to be as a result. And once that was clear, it made everything very easy. Well, easy as in it was a clear decision that we had to go public, and we had to go public fast.
Assemble the council.
Hockey and data breaches. Our guest today is Bankim Tejani, an all-around cyber ace in the hole and data breach survivor. Today, our special guest is Bankim Tejani. He is a security architect that has climbed to the titles of Distinguished Engineer and CISO. This is not a career path that is easily earned. Presently, he is a senior director for application security at a major retailer in Texas. Bankim Tejani is also a fractional or virtual CISO under his consulting practice, TINC Security, and he's also a hockey referee with USA Hockey. Bankim Tejani, please say hello to our audience.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for having me. It's great to have you. Great to join you on the Cybersecurity Council podcast.
We love having you here. Today, we will be talking about data breaches. Specifically, we will talk about the Under Armour MyFitnessPal data breach. Bankim lived through that breach, and he is here today to tell us about incident response and breach disclosures. The MyFitnessPal data breach was unique because the organization was able to disclose the data breach in just 4 days. And this was in early 2018, long before the SEC and other regulations were demanding timely disclosures. So today is a story about security folks responding to a crisis with responsibility and accountability. Bankim Tejani, have I introduced you correctly? Is there anything that you would like to redirect?
I think the only other thing I'd add is probably that you didn't cover is my career started really in software development. And so I also took that journey, starting out in software development and then moving into security, which I think more recently is more common. But when I did that 20 years ago, it was very uncommon.
Very first thing that I'd like to ask you about is the job title Distinguished Engineer. Now, that's a job title that has to be earned. And you've just hinted about growing from software engineering, moving over into security, and climbing the ladder. Just a couple of years back, you were chief security architect, a distinguished engineer at a financial services company. For many folks in information security, to become a chief security architect or a distinguished engineer represents an ultimate aspiration in the security landscape. Can you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you earned those titles?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think I'll start a little before that. I started my career as a programmer analyst, right? So in 2000, I would think that was my first, professional job title. And over the years, I've seen that titles have changed quite a bit. And there was a period in my life where I was really chasing that next title. And so I went from program analyst to software engineer. And then when I went to San Diego National Laboratories, they had a very different structure. They had a structure that many tech companies copied or had similar things from, but it was member of technical staff, senior member of technical staff, and then principal or distinguished member of technical staff. And those were very long steps, right? Like to get there, from member technical staff senior was sometimes 3 to 5 years, and a lot longer even from senior to principal and then distinguished. And so I think one of the things I've seen in my career timeframe of 20, 25 years now is that those steps have gotten a lot smaller because the expectation both of employees and employers have done that, but also there's a nexus of those title steps to things like HR, leveling, industry progression. All of those things go together. So over the years, I'd spent time as a senior consultant, a senior security consultant, an AppSec consultant, managing consultant, and then security architect, and then manager of product security. And so by the time I got to that financial services company, I came in with the title, like what they were looking for when they hired me was a chief security architect. And so I came in and I actually applied, for that role. It was actually through a firm that found me and sourced me for that title. When I came into the role, that title of chief security architect was actually leveled to be what they called a principal engineer. And so in my time there, what happened probably within the first 6 to 12 months that I was there, they were going through a lot of ladder and leveling, reshifting throughout the technology organization. And so, and with that many, they had a lot of principal level engineers, but they were also trying to stratify a higher group that would report to the CTO kind of as a dotted line and become, forum of distinguished engineers. And so they had decided to call that forum the distinguished engineers, either council or forum. I forget the exact word of it. But that was a group of the highest engineers throughout the organization from all the different lines of business that were developing software for all these different lines of business and the security organization. And so part of that structure was as the chief security architect, that was already a role that was filling to be in that space with those other engineering leaders. And then during that leveling process, I became a distinguished engineer as part of that. I think that there's another aspect to it, which is earning, I think, through experience, hard work, but also how you show up, the kinds of problems that you solve and focus on. And that's really where I see across the industry, at the principal, that distinguished engineer level, you're really looking at problems that drive the business and that create value and are very collaborative with other people at your level, but also collaborative with engineers that are levels lower than you to help them join into these cross-cutting outcomes. And that's I think, one of the areas where I think principal, even senior lead, staff engineers, right? That's the growth progression. But the growth progression isn't just how much more you know individually. It's also how much you can help others and how much you can align others to more complex outcomes that are maybe more complex even than their individual scope, but that fit into a larger picture of value for the company. In many cases in the security space, that value for the company is a defensive measure or a posture, or it's also an architecture of how you can craft your business to be more survivable, more reliable, and more resilient in a very changing threat landscape.
Here you are in financial services. You're looking at a landscape where you're making sure that everybody can contribute and everybody is having some meaningful changes and being able to propel the company forward. That's exactly what you want from an architect. I'd like to ask you, could you say a little bit more about elevating others? Maybe that was policy, maybe it was procedure, maybe it was actual architecture chops. How are you helping everybody up?
Some of that depends on what they need, right? So over my career was really building that skill set. Early on in my career was really all I could do was help someone technically because I knew a little bit more than them in there. And then over time, I learned more soft skills and I developed business skills to understand the context of different problem spaces or the larger outcomes that were at play, whether it was in a startup, whether in kind of a national security setting or in the financial services. And so over those years, I learned to develop that skill set, but then also to help and teach others. To me, I just brought that in with me as like my expectation. I don't know that company necessarily explicitly said you must develop others. That's something that I had just been doing for so many years at that point that I was always going to do that. And even in my current roles, I always do that. Even as a CISO, part of what I'm doing is helping to develop the companies that I'm working with and the staff that I'm working with there. It's not solely just, well, I tell you what to do, right? Like there has to be some growth there as well, because that's where the value is for the company, to do those things. And so I always try to do that. Part of it is also, I think, selfish maybe, in that it feels good, right? Like that's part of a human relationship.
Hockey, my friend. You have been a hockey referee. You've told me privately that there's a skill set there and a demeanor that you bring to your day job as an architect, as an engineer, as a cybersecurity leader. You tell us all more about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I've been refereeing now for, I think it's either 23 or 24 years. And I never if you had asked me before, I was like, this had nothing to do with security or technology. But over the years, what I've learned is that there's so many of those skills that I've brought to bear in these situations. I'll talk about a few. So one of them is, in a hockey game, it moves pretty fast, right? And so the play is going, and you have a very split second to make a decision, right? Whether you are calling a goal, not calling a goal, waving one off, calling a penalty, not calling a penalty, and how you conduct the play, and also how you communicate with others. In those split second decisions, you don't get replay. I mean, the pros get replay, but even they get, it's slow and it derails from the game. They have to pause the game to get replay. But in the moment, you don't get a replay. You also only get to see the play and the angle from your perspective. And so that is where it's not solely like, okay, you get your angle, right? The players may see it from a different angle because they're physically on a different spot on the ice. Your partner, the other official that's with you, or multiple, if you have linesmen, they're in a different angle and a different position. They're seeing that same play from a different vantage point. So there is necessarily not one always point of view, but you have to make the best decision. You still have to make the call in that split second based on what you see. And a part of that was all the preparation that you did beforehand. Were you skating well enough, positioned well enough to be in the right position to see the play? Because there are certain places on the ice where you're going to have a better angle and a better sight line to see that same play. And were you in the right spot? How did you get there? And that had nothing to do with that, 2 or 3 second moment when you had to make the decision. It actually had to do with the work you did beforehand. And then once you make the decision, how you make that call, right? And being clear, communicating well to the players. And also, if they disagree, how are you going to take that? If you make a mistake, which I've made mistakes on the ice, how do you take that, right? And sometimes that mistake means, hey, I called a penalty. That's what I thought I saw, and the other guy told me actually you didn't, right? But I already called it. It's done. It's on the board. And so how do you take accountability for that with others in a way that doesn't escalate anger and respond? And conversely, like you might be right and a player's still angry. How do you take that, right? How do you accept it and move forward, but also set an expectation of how you'll be communicated with and how you communicate to others? And this can go sideways in multiple ways, right? If they come with a level of anger or some choice words, right? Do you escalate the same way? Is that really going to lead to the best outcome? And then how you do that consistently over time, right? So here in Austin, I've been reffing in elites here pretty consistently since 2009. And so players know me, right? And so generally, like when I'm coming, like, they know I'm going to be in position most of the time. I'm going to make an effort. If I make a mistake, they know I'm going to own up to it, right? And if they ask in a reasonable manner, it's like, hey, what did you see? I'm going to explain it to them, right? But if they say, can't believe you missed that. It was a terrible call. Like, what do you want me to say to that, right? Like, that's not a question. And so we can talk afterwards. We can talk at a different point, but I'm happy to share. And there's definitely been times where I'm like, I think I made the wrong call, right? And you own up to it or you look at it afterwards. Now, when I started, you didn't have any kind of cameras really. Now you have GoPros, services where they do live streaming of games, and players will send you clips afterwards. They're like, "Oh, you made the wrong call there." Like, okay, sorry, But the things I always try to ask myself are like, was I in the right position? Was I looking at the right things? And did I try to apply the rule book correctly? And go from there.
I love the story of hockey that you're telling here, Bankim. I would like to ask you to complete the metaphor, spell it out for us. So, how does being in the right position in hockey apply to being in the right position as a CISO? How does making the right call in a split second in hockey line up to making the right call on an architect project? Finish the metaphor for us, my friend.
Sure. So I think, being in the right position, so much of that is really being in the right position within your business and within your teams. And that's not just like, sometimes that's title, right? There's definitely been times where like, I was the lead security person on a particular initiative or on a team, and I wasn't in the right meetings because I didn't have the right title, right? Like I was a senior manager, not a director, and so I couldn't be in this meeting. And so some of that is out of your control, some of that's within your control. But there's other parts of it, which is really, have you built the right trust over years with the teams that you need to for that moment, right? For when things happen. And so when you have something happen that's unexpected, have you established the right relationships with the right teams? Do your teams have the right level of trust? Do you have the right tools, mechanisms, and skills at your disposal to do that, right? And so sometimes that's personal skills, sometimes that's team and organizational skills, and that is all part of that picture, right? What prepares you for that moment isn't just what that point in time; it's all the years of work that you've done beforehand to establish that. And then in that moment, it's very much, how do you make that call? How do you decide, okay, is this something that we are going to, let's say, I'll take an example of like a bug bounty, right? So you have a responsible disclosure program or a bug bounty program, and something comes in from that disclosure program. How do you decide, is this something that you should stop all engineering work for? Like, do you pull the red cord proverbially and say, hey, we're going to stop all releases and we're going to fix this thing? What is that threshold for doing that? And if it's not something that's worth that level of interference in your engineering team's operations, okay, then where should it belong? Is it still an incident? Do you handle that with incident management and raise it as an incident? And what process do you use? Do you use your security process only? Do you use the engineering team's processes for supporting that? And then if it's lower than all of those things and it's really kind of a backlog item, well, then how do you position it? Where does it belong in the backlog relative to the other major functional or reliability defects that your team is working with? And where does that fit, right? And so you have to make those calls sometimes very rapidly. And fortunately, in the workplace, it rapidly is like sometimes days or weeks, whereas on the ice, it's like split second, right? And so, but sometimes it's still also split second, right? And that's what we see and where we have to kind of prepare ourselves for.
What are some of the most challenging projects that you have worked on during your career? What have you learned from them? And as you look back on them, have the lessons been different at the analyst, engineer, principal, distinguished engineer, chief security architect, and CISO? Do lessons learned today mean something different to you than at the beginning of your career journey?
One of the things I realized, spent some years doing application security consulting at Fortify Software during the startup years, and really at the dawn or early years of AppSec, not quite the dawn, but a little bit after the dawn of AppSec. And one of the things I identified was we're not always after the same outcome. It took me a long time to figure that out, because I always thought, I went into AppSec thinking, oh, really the outcome that we want is just better code, and how do we make these developers and our developers have better code all the time? And what I recognized actually was sometimes that wasn't what it's about. Sometimes it was about whose budget was buying which tool and how that rose their organization to a certain level and status. And so, there was a really great project, I thought, that just showcased a different model of operating. So it was consulting for a major bank, and their average AppSec issue, their time to fix was about 6 months for them to find an issue, triage it, flip it over the fence to a development team, negotiate for a while, roadmap it, and get that done. And we came in with a different approach to say, hey, let's look at having these static analysis tools available more directly to your development team. And we'll run a pilot with a couple teams. You pick the teams, and what we're going to ask is that these teams fix a reasonable number of issues in a short period of time. Right. So we ask each team to fix 20 issues of their choosing or their practice in 30 days. But compared to this bank had one issue fixed about 6 months. Right. So that time curve was huge. In the end, we actually spent less than that time. The team spent only a total less than 2 weeks of man hours across 3 different development teams. And instead of fixing the 20 each that they fixed almost 160 issues, right? In a faster period. We're like, hey, this proves the success of this program. And we're like, this is like a tee up of hey, this approach, this model would be really beneficial for you to have better outcomes in AppSec. And it also improved the relationship between those development teams and the security team because it was more empowering and less terse and more timely instead of being much later. And it was sort of a wake-up call when they didn't pursue that process and that pilot any further, because what that ended up being effectively an organizational threat to the application security program team, because they had built this entire team, justified a large team size with this cadence. And all of a sudden, if that cadence was a fraction of what it once was, well, what does that apparatus do, right? And what should they be doing? And so that was such a threat that they didn't want to move forward with that alternative model. And that was it was kind of a heartbreaker because we put a lot of time, effort, thought, and collaboration with those development teams to pilot this new approach. But it wasn't just about that success, right? There was a broader set of outcomes that they were after, which was, how do we rise the SAPSEC program that they were building to a greater scale and a greater thing. And they weren't necessarily looking at how could an innovative model improve the AppSec of lots of different applications, improve the security posture of the applications, but at the expense of maybe the size of the organization. And that wasn't a trade-off they were willing to make. And that was quite interesting and a very sharp lesson to learn kind of in the career.
You have offered a very profound insight here. It sometimes, and I'm going to try to use your words, it is not that an organization is striving to build better and faster and stronger software. Sometimes there's a self-preservation element involved, and there's the politics of who owns, who purchases, and who controls the process and the technology. I've certainly seen what you are observing here in my own career. I've worked in organizations that are so large that they have different lines of business. The theory is you can still streamline and have common practices, but even when you're trying to do the right thing, you are imposing control. You are imposing friction on those lines of businesses because they have to yield and they have to do it your way. And I think it's really important that anybody that is, per our conversation today, climbing towards principal, climbing towards distinguished engineer, climbing towards CISO, they have to understand what Bankim understands. It's about the emotional intelligence. It's about building the trust with all of these organizations because you're building agreements.
Yeah.
I think that's incredibly important. I'd like to try to be a little bit more specific here. As soon as a CISO or a security department chooses a technology tool, let's say specifically a security tool, let's stay with AppSec. Let's say you want to choose a specific security software development tool, like a Checkmarx, a Fortify, or another product. You are telling everyone, here's how you check in code, here's how you start a project, here is how you check for vulnerabilities, here's the exception process. It comes with this long list of processes. This is how we operate, this is who we are. All of these things can be healthy, but they are all, every single one of them is also a friction. It's a bar that somebody has to jump over. So I just think your insight is incredibly important, and I hope everybody's hearing it.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, and it's one of the things I've tried to do is to like minimize that friction of partnering and working with security and working with me. And in many cases, it's by necessity, right? When you are small, when you have a very small team, you have to do that because you don't have the ability to be the gatekeepers of every stage or every step and to have that friction everywhere. In some cases, it actually, I would say, companies that were very early to security programs sometimes get trapped in that because they were so mature so early that they're not necessarily always tapping into some of the innovations that have come later that reduce that friction. And so there's a trade-off with that. And we see that, like, this is throughout the world, right? And I always remember it's not any different. Like, if you go to Europe, you go to India, for instance, where I've traveled, their cellular networks are way better than ours. And they've been way better for like 10 or 15 years. But it wasn't because they're better. Most of it's technology developed by American companies. It's their deployment was better because they didn't have a copper wire network to lean on. And so, we had the best copper wire telegraph network in the world for a century or more. And so it was a lot of friction to change that over to go full cellular. When cellular came about, those countries saw that as an opportunity to jump. We're like, okay, we don't have to build a copper network that spans this entire country and landscape anymore. We can just go straight to cellular and get way better speed and more reliability. And you see that periodically just in all forms of other technology where jumping generations forward can give you those leaps. And sometimes when you're early, you pay a penalty, right, for being that early mover to do that, because then you have to do that. And so how do you balance that? How do you make sure that there are points in time when you rebuild and revisit? One of the things I always ask when I talk to different development teams and engineering leaders is like, when was the last time you built something that was the right thing to build at the time you built it? And then a few years later, you decided it's not right for us to have anymore, and you ripped it out and went to either a library or a commercial tool or something else because you said it, when we built it, nothing existed. And now something else exists that does most of what we need. And actually the cost for us to maintain what we have is greater than the cost for us to just switch over to this other thing. And I think that's a really good sign of mature engineering leaders, but also, whether it's security or anything else, where you said, okay, it's actually time for us to do that, right? Like, and you're willing to be open to doing that. You can't always be stuck in, we built this, we have to have it forever. There are times and circumstances where it's going to change, and you want to be able to pivot when it makes sense.
From my own background, I have one story to offer. We were building AppSec. We were in an environment where we had to get 10 to 20 products delivered like every 2 weeks. So this was 7+ years ago. So this was a lot of velocity for that time frame. And we found ourselves having to get projects through every single security checkpoint in these very agile, very condensed, very streamlined timeframes. During that journey, we were having trouble with pen testing. You have to schedule pen tests. You have to inform the pen tester. You've got to show and prepare environments. You have to do all of these things. And this can be very difficult to achieve in a short amount of time. No matter how sophisticated your technology was, especially 7+ years ago.
Yep.
So during this journey, we started building our own automated pen testing tools. You could check in a new project, a new product, a new environment, and bam, we could do some automated pen testing. This was basic, it was nominal, but it did serve a function. And to your point, as the years ticked by, and it was a short set of years, it was like 18 months. It's like, wow, we don't need to do this anymore because all sorts of commoditized products were coming on the market to be able to do that. Yeah. There was Acunetics. Even Burp Suite itself was becoming more and more automated all the time. And Covert Swarm and all of these other sophisticated automated pen testing tools were beginning to emerge. Yeah. But yeah, there's absolutely moments where you can spot a problem, architect and engineer a solution, and it is obsolete through no fault of your own in a short period of time. Now, puzzles like that that's why we have architects, because they can look at all of it and go, all right, I see what we did. I see why we did it. Now we got to bridge ourselves to the future. That's why I'm an architect. I know how to do that.
Yeah.
Have you seen similar things?
I mean, that completely resonates with me, and I've seen that, and it's a great story. I would ask a question actually in terms of that, like when you first set up that service, right? What compromises did you make in terms of what you could automate versus getting like complete coverage, right? I think that's one of the most philosophical questions in security to consider is that, like, do I want total coverage, or do I focus on what I can automate well at scale right now? And I'm really curious how you guys approach that.
With our automated pen testing solution of yesteryear, we could do the basics. Yeah. Meaning we could do a web service with a limited set of features, and we could do basic tests. What we were really doing was using the back end of Burp Suite. There was a year in there where they gave a headless version of Burp Suite. Yep, I remember. And we just started to use that to do a bunch of testing.
Yeah.
So that comes with lots of trade-offs. There's lots of stuff you can't test. There's lots of higher level or higher order behavioral dynamics that a pen tester can go and look for, but a set of scripted basic tests are not going to get anywhere near.
Yeah.
So this solved some problems for us, but in no way did it conquer everything. And I will to this day always defend that a human pen tester is the right solution for many different pen tests.
Yeah. And I agree. Like, there are some things that, and especially high order problems and whatnot, I think you may not be giving yourself quite enough credit. That I would venture to say this, right? The other thing that you did, whether you knew it or not, was to land an element of trust with your development teams of having this process of security testing in their development flow, in their SDLC or in their CI/CD pipeline, right? And by making it scalable, palpable, you help drive that through. And then later, whenever you did upgrade to another tool, you didn't have to have a battle about, we're going to put this tool in the CI/CD pipeline, because they already knew, oh, hey, we were doing this testing before. This is just going to replace that testing with something a little bit better. And you established that. But you also would have had to do that in a way, right? Because any test like that, even with Burp Suite, you have to scale up, right? And so you started with one or two and you built up, right? And so there's an implicit trust building process that happens with that. Sometimes we think about it, sometimes we don't, but that's that journey that you had with your development teams to establish that, and then for them to give you that credibility to put that into their process.
I think you're absolutely right. We live in a world now where unit tests, functional tests, smoke tests, regression tests, in a lot of cases, that is built, owned, and managed by the software engineering teams themselves anyway. That stuff, oftentimes it doesn't even exist as an independent QA function, at least not totally. Like, we have the testing tools are with the engineers now in a lot of organizations.
Yeah. And if there is an extra team that works with them, usually it's an SRE kind of team, right? A site reliability engineer or reliability engineering of some sort, where they're the ones that are partnering, because very few organizations have that like separate QA anymore. QA is typically embedded with the same engineering team or working very closely with SRE kinds of functions.
Bankim, it's been absolutely excellent having you here. I would like to take you to the topic that I'm sure a lot of listeners would like to hear from. You have lived through a significant data breach, and you have a lot of relevant wisdom to share. Now, most people in cybersecurity fear their organization going through a data breach, especially one that's in the news. You were at Under Armour, owner of the MyFitnessPal app, when a breach occurred in early 2018 that landed on all the major TV news networks and online outlets. This is something that even Brian Krebs was paying attention to. So in a moment, I'm going to ask, what was that experience like for you? And how have you brought that experience into all of your future work, like distinguished engineer, CISO roles, and other places? So that's the question I'm going to pose to you in a moment. But first, I'm going to very quickly remind our audience about that MyFitnessPal breach, because there's been so many breaches. Let's just outline this. So in February 2018, the MyFitnessPal app was the victim of a large-scale breach, affected maybe 150 million users. Hackers gained access to usernames, email addresses, and possibly even some hashed passwords. What was not stolen includes payment card data, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, because all of that information was successfully processed separately. So the breach was discovered on March 25th, and users were notified 4 days later. We're definitely going to talk about this 4-day discovery to breach disclosure. Under Armour and the app's owners worked with law enforcement and data security firms to investigate the breach. You did eventually and very quickly recommend that users update their passwords. Encryption was involved, app, website, actions of an employee. There's always accountability issues and trying to figure out root cause of any breach. But you guys got there. So I return to you, my friend. What was the experience like for you? How have you taken those lessons from the past into your present roles?
So I'll start with like the maybe the personal side of that experience. And so, that really starts when we discovered the breach, right? And when we found out about it. And so we had a security intelligence firm reach out to us and say, hey, we think we might have found your data, right? Or that we found your data in the dark web, and you should know about it. So it took me a while to download this data set from them to be able to confirm it and investigate and check into it. Ironically, I went to go play hockey. This was on a Sunday. I just went to play hockey, came back, and the data set was downloaded and started digging into it. And you're like, okay, yeah. And there was that moment of like, oh, crap, right? This is our data. And we were able to do that. And a big part of that, one was the trust in relationships, right? Because that day, I mean, it was on a Sunday, I had to get help from our support team to validate some records. I had to get help from one of our engineers to help set up a data environment for me to study some of this data in. And so, having that trust of like, hey, I wouldn't, Bankim's not going to ask for this unless it's important, but also without giving them any context, right? Like just sort of say, hey, like do this for me without context and doing that. And so that, that's years of trust to like build and establish and be able to do it quickly. And of course we informed my CISO, de facto CISO at the time, the director of InfoSec, our privacy legal team, like right away, we kind of spun up this apparatus. And so by the next morning, we had a full-blown incident response going with that. But so much of that, it's easy to say we had this incident response apparatus. That was multiple years of like preparation and positioning to have that, right? To have the trust of our customer support team, have the relationship between security, legal, privacy, risk management, and also to have our vendors already in place, right? We had a forensics firm in place. We had outside counsel in place. And so a lot of these things, it was very easy to spin up because we had done that preparation. But also with our engineering teams, we had tremendous degree of trust that we built up over I think prior to that 2.5 years that I'd been there before then. And we'd had some practice. We'd had some practice with leadership and executive tabletops that we had done 6 or 8 months before then. But also had practice of incident management. I alluded to this a little bit before when we had established our responsible disclosure program. At that time, I think it was still private. We also established a process of like, here's the criteria for which we're going to handle these kinds of things that come in. And here's the criteria for which it's a SEV0 incident where it stops work, right? We're SEV1. And so we'd already aligned all of those things to our engineering objectives and to our product objectives. And so everybody was on the same page around all of these things. And so spinning up the team and the apparatus, getting a partnership with our different groups to execute was very rapid because we had established all of those patterns before. We didn't have wholly separate things. We had the same patterns. And so we already had a culture of whenever we had an incident like this, of establishing some private Slack channels, having calls, incident command kind of function, people that could go do the work, and other people that were kind of communicating upward and outward and creating space for everyone to do things. And also a culture that, like, when you got read in to something like this, it was your responsibility to go and catch up on the thread, right? And that was one of the aspects that our outside counsel even called out, is like trying to do that via email, to read people in and then have them, forward them a bunch of email or like catch them up. It always took days to do via email. We did it in minutes because there was a Slack history and we had a very strong culture of keeping that visible there within that Slack history. So new whether it was engineering leaders, some of the other members of the security team, they could just go and catch up very quickly and see it. And we had, good summaries of what's happening in different periods. Pretty rapidly, we recognized that the attackers were on a kind of a smash and grab kind of operation where they went in, they got access, they went straight after dumping user data, their email addresses and password hashes, and they got out. And as you said, there was also other data, right? The other things that we really, already care about and we always want to make sure we protect. We didn't collect payment in those applications, right? We had payment that was done very separately, primarily through the app stores. So we never even handled the payment. We didn't have those payment records in those databases and in that environment. Some of the other things that we had done years before that were, Under Armour had acquired MyFitnessPal. They also acquired MapMyFitness and Endomondo. And so we had these other fitness apps that were there. And we made a very conscious choice to keep all of that infrastructure separate from the corporate infrastructure. And it sounds like it's perfectly logical and like, that makes total sense. That was a battle at that time because the mindset was, well, we bought these companies that should come into our infrastructure. And that was a struggle to sort of say, no, we don't want to do that. We want to keep that separate, but we also want to insulate things that happen on corporate from these consumer-facing products, but things that happen in these consumer-facing products from our corporate network. And having that separation strategy certainly paid off in that context. It was the right decision in hindsight, but it wasn't necessarily self-evident at the beginning. Right? That was something that we really had to struggle to make happen. But that did help us in this because we knew, okay, and here's the boundaries of what they could have accessed and not. And we already knew there was no driver's license data. There was no social security numbers. There was no payment information in those spaces. And then we were able to trace, once we had the forensics and looking at it, we were able to trace what they looked at and trace what queries they made and identify, okay, this was very, very rapidly, they went straight for a structure. And they were very intelligent, right? This crew went after some very arcane, specific Ruby vulnerabilities. And then they used them and they went after, some very standard structures that almost any Ruby app has in terms of how it structures user data and those things. And then they went after that. And we were also, I think, fortunate in that once we knew that, we also saw what they had access to in the data sets that the intelligence firm was able to share with us. We were able to identify, okay, this is the data fields that they downloaded and they took them in these records. And their queries show that while they had access to more columns, let's say more data fields in the space, they chose specifically to only query the ones that they wanted, and that's what they extracted out in their extracts. And a year or so later, after everything had happened, a year later, a number of other companies that were impacted by the same crew found out that they were impacted. So we were really, in some ways, we were lucky that we found out so early, but us finding out early also played into protecting others because we found out early and we went public so rapidly that crew that was doing this operation really as a mechanism to capture passwords and crack them and then resell them. Their operations got disrupted, and because of that, they started to mistrust each other because they didn't think they were at the point of getting caught. When this went public, they thought, they kind of turned on each other in that time frame, and that helped them to be pursued.
You very competently outlined a response. I want to double click on the emotional experience here, because you, Bankim, you were part of this breach, not literally from day one, but from like minute one all the way until the end.
All the way
right?
to the end.
Okay. So you're downloading data to validate whether or not your company has been exposed. So from the very first moments of this, it is you, hands on keyboard.
Yeah.
You have to know your company's data, database schemas. You're looking at what's out there and you're trying to figure out, hey, yeah, this actually is MyFitnessPal. This is our stuff. You've talked a lot today about emotional intelligence, managing relationships, preparing for the moment. And from that original moment, you very matter-of-factly explained, well, I started notifying these people. I'm using the appropriate channels. I'm elevating the information. I'm getting the right people engaged to do further steps in the incident response process. So you did what most awesome cybersecurity people did. You made the call and you started working the issues. But where was your emotional health? Like, how did you manage that as just like the first 48 hours unfolded?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're definitely scared for sure. Like, okay, what does this mean? And I think part of how I'm wired is that the logical part kind of took over, right? Of like reacting, that. I think a lot of the emotions came in really Thursday after we went public, right? In that weekend. So, that was Sunday. We went public Thursday afternoon. And in that time, I think, I slept maybe 3 hours a night. I was, at the office. And the other part that was really memorable about this point in my life, you asked kind of what's going on personally, emotionally. My wife was 7.5 months pregnant. And so we were expecting, our first kid, our only kid. And that, but all of that was happening right then. And it's like, okay, this happened. I have to go, right? I went to the office and then I was there, till 2, 3 a.m. every day, back in by 6 or 7. I'm just really getting a couple hours of sleep for the entire week and until Thursday. And so much of it was go, 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 adrenaline and really like partnering with the teams. That weekend, it really hit. Like once it went public and we had a little bit of downtime, we had some stuff though. So once it went public, we had a bit of a surge of course, customer support tickets. We had a FAQ right away for our customers, but as soon as it went public, we were still kind of live streaming any new questions that came in that weren't already addressed. We were doing that live with legal. As that wound down, it was like, am I going to be employable again? Right.
2018, I can understand that would have occupied your mind. Nowadays, having survived and done the right things during a breach is actually a benefit to your resume.
Correct. And that's what played out over time, right? Over time, it played out that way. And it did open up doors and conversations and interviews, and telling those things. But yeah, at the time it was like, I don't know, right? Like, I mean, that was, one of the largest reported data breaches, and certainly which is a press coverage, because that Thursday or that Friday was a Good Friday, right? So the markets were closed. And so really this was a story almost the whole weekend until Monday, right? And it was, in other ways, the story also fizzled because it was, Thursday night, Friday, Saturday, and then things sort of like fizzled and go. And that's some of how this happens, right? It gets reported and then eventually sort of fizzles a little bit. So a lot of that was very stark and interesting to see and see what happened, right? And there was certainly a question of like, okay, am I going to get fired, right? Like I didn't think that was likely, but is that a piece of it? What does this mean for career and prospects? But also, what does this mean for my team? So it wasn't just me, right? Like, how are they impacted? And let's say, either stained or kind of branded by having been through this. And I think, as you said, now it's not the same anymore. The fact that you had that experience is actually more valuable to other companies because you have these lessons that you've learned from it, that you can bring with you. But it was stark. And then afterwards, we had all the aftermath. We had, a lot of after actions that we had to do. And then it was a longer kind of flow. And I was lucky in that the first couple of weeks were very busy. Not all nighters like the first week, but, still kind of busy. And then it did tamper down. We had our kiddo. I was able to take some time off and spend some time with her, but also to have some of the rest of the actions stretched into a longer period over the next few months after that.
The data breach for MyFitnessPal started with an external party telling you, hey, we think maybe we found your data on the dark web. There is a benefit to an external party being the initiator of a breach investigation. One of the things that I worry about is what happens inside of a company when you're wrangling over whether or not or how to do a disclosure. Your general counsel may want more information. Your CEO or other parties within the company may not want things handled in a certain way. They may not want to disclose the breach at all. Hence, we have SEC and other regulations now that force a lot of things or compel a lot of things for organizations of certain sizes and shapes and industries. But my point is, internally, there can be turmoil and chaos as you're contending with how do we investigate, who says what to the press, how do we say it, how do we tell our user base? These things can be contentious. In your situation with MyFitnessPal, this entire ball got rolling because an external party said, hey, we may have found your data. The benefit here is that in some ways starts the clock and also tells everyone within your organization, this is already public whether we like it or not. So suddenly you can lose the politics and you can start driving straight through incident response to a healthy and responsible disclosure. In your case, you got the word out in 4 days. This is back before SEC and all of the other compulsory requirements to timely disclosure.
It's also a month before GDPR went live, right? So GDPR was already announced, but it hadn't gone into effect until May 2018. So it was about a month and change before that. So I think one of the facets for me that stood out in that process, and I think you're right? Like having that external influence can be an accelerator in some ways. But I think in our case at Under Armour MyFitnessPal, the biggest accelerator was really the values of the company and the leadership, right? And Kevin Plank, who was a CEO at that time, I think is now again, I think it was in 2016, he said at South by Southwest that trust is something that's built in drops and lost in buckets. That was something that's really baked into his values and the DNA of the company. And so very quickly, we recognized once we knew what the attackers got, right? And they wanted usernames and emails, and what they were really after was cracking them. What we recognized was that the ultimate attack, all right, the victims of whatever was going to happen next with this data was not actually going to be us and our site or the data that we happen to have about customers. What they were after was taking those credential pairs, right, email addresses and cracked passwords, and applying them to other places where they can get into those accounts. And so very quickly that saying, okay, our customer, right, our athletes, and I remember our customers were athletes is how we framed it in the business. And so our athletes were the ones that were at risk. And so at that stage, there was zero hesitation about going public, but also about the speed of going public, right? Even our outside counsel had never done a breach disclosure that fast before. And that didn't necessarily matter. We pushed them as well beyond their comfort zone because that was the right thing for our customers, right? And that was the right thing for the business to say, we want to protect our customers and our athletes, and this is the right thing for them. The faster we let them know, the less likely they are going to have negative outcomes in other places because of the password they happen to use on MyFitnessPal is the same password they used at a bank or somewhere else. And the more rapidly we can let them know, the better they're going to be as a result. And once that was clear, it made everything very easy. Well, easy as in it was a clear decision that we had to go public and we had to go public fast. I'm not saying that it was easy in the journey because there's plenty of challenges there, but that was the right values. And I think that's the element that was the most clear. And
Bankim Tejani, thank you for being here with the Cybersecurity Council. You have survived a data breach. You've lived to tell about it. You are sharing all of those experiences here with our audience. And you have also explained the virtues and benefits of architecture, growing your career, working your way up to CISO type roles. You're somebody that we should absolutely listen to. So I want to very much thank you for being here. So, Tejani, do you have any closing comments for our audience?
I want to thank you at the work that you and Brian have done building this community. It's been great, and I've really enjoyed being a part of it. And I really wish everyone success. Right, and I think the challenge for all of us over into the future is how do we help our businesses? Right, our businesses are now there and are all really at risk in some ways, but also because the landscape has changed. And we have to, the perimeter used to be the country and the nation state, and now it's our networks, and now it's our applications, and now it's our day-to-day operations. And so how do we innovate through that? And how do we find ways to do that at scale, but also to do it at a cost and a budget that's affordable? Because we can't all, we don't have unlimited resources. And how do we do it in a way that is appropriate, but also really the best stewards of our company's resources and time?
Welcome to the Cybersecurity Council. This council strives to showcase unique cybersecurity leadership stories. Its mission is to demystify and simplify cybersecurity across the entire business landscape. Best practices, lessons learned, operational recommendations, it's all here.